Okay, hello, good morning. I am doing this at the behest of Dave, but also because we get quite a lot of questions about it here now. I'm Daniel. I'm one of the admins on Stardot. I have had Acorn machines for some years. I've still got my very suntanned Acorn Electron sitting here on the shelf. But so what I wanted to talk about today was preserving decaying floppy disks. Let me make sure I can see this. So what I'll attempt to cover is a little bit about disks in the drive. I'm sure this will be teaching a load of people to suck eggs, but may not. Formats of the disks, a little bit of a discussion about the philosophy of preserving them, how we can go about preserving them, including the tools needed, and a case study, and then I will try and answer questions. I do not profess to be an exceptionally detailed expert in all aspects of this, but I have an overview of doing it, and I've done it quite a few times with quite a few different disks, so we'll see where we get to. Right. I should also say that I've pillaged lots of this, and I've learned lots of this from Jean-Louis Guérin's website. It is excellent. He has collated a huge amount of information about the sort of low-level workings of floppies and protection on the ST and all sorts of other things. And I thoroughly recommend having a look at his website if you want to try and burrow through more. So, floppy disks. I think everyone has probably seen one of them, from 8-inch all the way down to 3.5-inch, some of which are high density, some of which are double density, but they're dying. The data on them is harder to get off. We've got fewer machines that can deal with them, and so that's really what we want to sort of try and look at doing, is getting the data off those disks and preserving it for future use, and be able to access it as it was originally accessed. A little bit about the drive. So essentially, what the drive is doing is reading magnetic fluxes off the surface of the disk. So the disk is a piece of mylar coated in a material or in an iron oxide that can be magnetized, and that's spun around, and the head just sits above it and just measures when the polarity, or the way that the iron oxide has been magnetized, flips, a change in polarity or a flux, and it'll have something to spin the disk. On many systems, there's something to check where the disk is, so that's that index LED. I don't know whether you can. Oh, you can see that nice index LED. So that tells it where it is. So on a 5.25-inch drive, that's a hole. On a 3.5-inch, it's the orientation of the spindle. Something to drive the disk head up and down, and something to also to tell you when you've hit the end and you can't go any further. So what's actually on the disk? Well, this is, as I say, flux changes in polarity of the surface. So when a disk is written, the right head, a current is applied to it, and it lines up all of the little tiny magnets, I guess, in the surface of the disk in one direction, and then it can flip them and magnetize them in the opposite direction. And this goes on, and if you do this round the track, you can then read it back in exactly the same way you'd read a tape back, just by seeing when these polarities change, and it will lead to a little jump in current. It will induce a current in the read head. So that's essentially what you're doing. You're looking at when the polarity of the surface of the disk has shifted. And what the disk drive will do is take those sort of subtle shifts in polarity, amplify them, and turn them into distinct pulses, which are what are transmitted back to the computer. So the computer gets back a series of pulses, or if it wants to write a disk, it's transmitting a series of pulses. So that's fine, okay? You've got pulses going in and out, but what do they mean? So the most important thing, I've put these in the wrong order, the most important thing actually, so far as the computer is concerned, or so far as interpreting these, is the time between the pulses. And that's dictated by the speed of the disk. But you can use the time between the pulses, or the flux changes, to say whether you're reading a 1 or a 0, or that's basically it, ones and zeros. So I've got two pictures here. This is a scatter plot from, well, on the left-hand side is a single density disk, and you can see that the pulses are either 4 microseconds or 8 microseconds between them, and that'll be whether, so things which have a 4 microsecond pulse between them will actually be ones on the disk. Things that have an 8 between them will be zeros on the disk, and I'll explain a little bit why in a second. And then next to that is a dual density disk, and you can see that the pulses are falling at 4, 6, and 8. And there's a reason for that. And I'll go backwards now. And the reason for this is the encoding scheme. So you've got pulses, you've got the time between them, but you have to work out how to sort of reliably convert those back into ones and zeros. So FM, which is the format that or frequency modulation, or single density, which is the format that Beeb uses, has a constant ticking of a clock every 8 microseconds, which is why you see a 0 will still register pulses of 8 microseconds. So if you're getting 2 reversals within that 8 microsecond window, i.e. 4 microseconds and 4 microseconds, that's 1. And only 1 reversal, that's at the 8 microseconds, that's the clock, which is constantly beating along to keep all the hardware circuitry and the drive sort of ticking with it. That will be 0. That's fine, and we know that we can store 200K aside on an 80 track with the BBC, but it's not the most efficient use of space. So modified frequency modulation, or double density, you only get a clock if there is a 0 preceded by a 0. And that essentially means that you can squeeze an awful lot more in to a much smaller space, as the bottom of these two demonstrates or illustrates. I mean, the reason for this is because if you don't have any pulses at all, your phase lock loop in the actual drive starts drifting off, and you become unreliable. So having pulses at least a sort of semi-regular sort of interval keeps everything locked in and keeps the drive being able to read the pulses on the disk and keeps time between them. So we've got pulses and the time between. We know how to change pulses back into ones and zeros, and it's those ones and zeros which actually end up being the physical format of the disk. So within the disk, you've got a series of tracks, and each track is divided into sectors, and the sectors have a specific format, and you can go and look at the data sheet for any of the floppy disk controllers, like the 11772, and it'll explain what the recommended format for single density and double density is. But essentially what you're saying is you'll have a sequence of bytes after the index pulse, because there's a bit of time after that happens, and it could potentially overwrite as it goes right the way around the track. And then you'll have identifiers which mark the field. It'll tell you the track side. Sectors, the length of the sector. So sectors tend to be 128, 256, 512. bytes, 1024 bytes, DLC check bytes, and then gaps. So, I mean, one thing to note is the gaps are really important because although some computers write entire tracks at once when they rewrite it, lots of others will look for the sector and rewrite the sector. And so there's a slight gap between it identifying the sector and then starting to write, and you get these splices. So having these little gaps in between the ID field for the sector and the actual data for the sector mean that you don't end up overwriting IDs or data. You've got enough of a sort of gap that you can have this splice in there. And you can see these splices when you actually start looking at the disk. Anyway, so these are single density and double density formats. Sectors repeated across the disk. This is a visualization of that. So let's see. So this here, this is using the HFE Floppy emulator software, and it's actually a PC disk. But you can see that's where the index lies, and then each sector, the light green is the sector header, and then dark green is data, the data field. And you can see that this software has decoded the sector IDs, the track IDs, the side IDs, knows what the mark byte for data is, and the CRCs. And also is talking about these cells are actually the bit cells, which are the timing cells on the disk. So for our purposes with Acorn machines, these are the standard formats we tend to see. They're fairly standard, to be honest, amongst many of these things. But I think the important thing is to be aware of what we'd expect to see when we think about starting to preserve disks. And if it doesn't look like that, then it's probably not what you were thinking it was, or it's something special. So that's disks, formats, and how they're written. And I just wanted to say something a little bit about thinking about preserving these disks. I don't know whether anyone knows what this is. You can unmute yourself if anyone wishes to answer. No. This is a cave in France called Lascaux, except it isn't. This is Lascaux 2. Lascaux, the original cave, which is famous for these cave paintings, these very detailed cave and beautiful ancient Neolithic cave paintings. You can't go into. It was discovered by a couple of school children. They fell in. It was open to the public for a while, but it started going horribly mouldy, and it's been sealed up to preserve that which exists within it. And an exact replica of the cave was made. Now you could say, well, we could take pictures of the paintings, and that's good enough, and that, you know, we can live with that. But actually, that loses the context, and that loses everything. So the next best thing to being able to go to the actual cave itself is to go to this exact replica of the cave. Now this is happening more and more now with huge number of ancient sites. We're using laser scanning and all sorts of things to produce virtual representations of everything. But the real key to all of this preservation is trying to preserve the context as well. So what I guess I'm trying to get at here is that we could think about taking a picture of the stuff that's on the disk and just sort of keeping it, so getting the games working and so on. But actually, we probably should start thinking more in terms of preserving those within their context. So if it's a protected disk, you know, all of the protection intact, all of the way that disk was originally written, because that's part of the history of the piece of software itself. So that leads on to different methods of preservation. So as I just said, you could scoop the data off the disk and make it work in an emulator. That's what we do with SSDs. That's what you can do with Up Yours or Beeb as well, if it will happily do it. You can copy the disk, crack the protection, get something that works in an emulator. Off you go. Those disk images, you need to know something about what they're designed to work in, because there's absolutely nothing other than the raw sector data. So that data segment from the sector which has been saved and those sequentially. It doesn't tell you anything about the geometry of the disk or anything. You could scoop it off and try and include some information about the format. There's a few that do that, formats that do that. IMD tells you something about the layout of the disk at least, and how many tracks and so on, and how big the sectors are. You could scoop the data from the disk and any information you can about the quirks on it. So FSD and AFD, you've looked at some of the Archimedes software preservation project, you'll have come across AFD files. They try and store information about the errors which are used in copy protection. So an awful lot of copy protection works by causing the disk controller to produce an error and spotting that error or an inconsistent result, and spotting that when it checks for whether it's an original disk is what allows it to run. So if you know what those errors that you're expecting to see are, and you can inject them into the proceedings, then you can fool the copy protection and make it run. So with these, you have an indication of what was on the disk, but you don't know what actually caused the error. You just know the secondary effect. Well, the other thing you can do, which is what I would advocate, is take everything off the disk and don't worry about the format and worry about extracting the data from it later on. So really what you're doing here is taking the times between the fluxes. So just capturing that stream of times, and that's all these formats are. So the SCP format, which I'll talk about a little bit, well, I won't talk about the format. The CryoFlux, which people might have heard of, or the Flux engine, and so on. All of these formats are basically just recording the timings between fluxes. So, how do you record these? Well, there have been a variety of options. For a long, long time, the CryoFlux was probably the only option that you had. You can still buy them. They are €99. That's one. They're probably 10 years old. They are, if you buy one, the support is via a forum and is patchy, I think I could say. And I don't think the software has been updated for a while. Then you've also got the SuperCard Pro, which is supported, does very much the same as the CryoFlux, $99. You can order it from there. Flux Engine, which David Given has done, which some of you might have seen on the forum. I think you can put one together for about £15. There is the Disk Ferret, which I think is verifiably dead, but someone may prove me wrong. And then the final one is the Greaseweazel, which has been quite actively supported at the moment. And you can put one together using one of these little blue pill boards for probably about £5 if you really want to. They're not very expensive to put together, and that is where you can download the software and the firmware from. So that one. So what do I use? I have got a couple of 5 1/4" drives that I use. I use a 40-track one and an 80-track one. And those I use with a slightly later model of the Greaseweazel. I've got an 80-track 3.5" drive. I use the HFE Floppy emulator software, which is open source and can be downloaded from the website I've given there. I use Keir Fraser's disk utilities. Keir Fraser is the designer of the Greaseweazel, a hex editor, and I've been known to use Fairy Liquid as well with it. So there you go. So that first picture is my two 5 1/4" drives, and that's the Greaseweazel 7 on top of it. You can buy kits from Kia to put these together. They are a bit, well, they're okay if you're happy to do surface mount. This is one in progress. I think he's charging £7 or £8 for one of the kits with all the parts. So they're not very expensive. Or if you go the other route, which is the F1 route, you need to find yourself a blue pill board, which doesn't have a fake microcontroller on it. Your mileage may vary. Bitsbox seem to be selling genuine ones, but you know, up to you. If you're happy putting something together, going for this one is probably the best route. Right, what I said I'd do now is attempt an ill-fated live demo. So what I'm going to try and do is just quickly. I've got a copy of that, which I've popped in. Let's see. I'm going to share a different window. I've popped in my 80-track drive. So the way Greaseweazel works, basically, you attach your drive to it, and it takes over controlling the drive, and you run it connected to your PC via USB cable from the command line. You used to have to install Python, but the whole thing is now standalone. Let me just share this other window. Let's see, that one. That one, I think. Oh, there we go. Right, okay. That gone off the bottom, or is it mostly there? Okay, essentially what you're doing, well, you can see the command I just typed there. I'm gonna read it off the other drive. So that command at the bottom is all you need to type to actually hoover the disk off. I've said single-sided. There's no point in taking both of this one. And it will just chug along tediously, copying the disk. It does 3 revolutions per track. I'm not sure at the moment whether you can access the different revolutions or whether the HFE software takes them into account when it's trying to decode them. I have a feeling it is, but don't quote me on that because I don't quite get the ins and outs of it. Slow and tedious. Okay, so one thing I would also say is that it tends 5 1/4 inch discs tend to actually have it go up to potentially 82 tracks, and sometimes you do find data, or at least recording marks on the latest tracks. Anyway, what this has now done is created a file. It's about, I think, a double-sided file would be about 30 meg in size of the timings between the fluxes. It's in the Supercarb Pro format. You've got a couple of different options now to try and process that into something that you can try and look at the data in. And what I tend to do is load it into the HFE Floppy emulator, simply because it gives you a visualization of it. If I go to load that, okay, I need to share a different screen. So new share, we'll share this. See that? Right, there we go. That's the HFE software. So we say load, and I think it's this one, and that's the file that I just produced. Open. Okay, so that's done that. And what the HFE software will do is attempt to decode whatever's on the surface of the disk. So if I click this, whoop, oh dear. Right, okay, there you go. You can see that it has decoded it. You see these gaps between the tracks. That's because it's actually a 40-track disc. Also, there's an awful lot of red and the odd orange sector which hasn't read properly. Now, that's probably because my drive heads are filthy after having done something with another disc. Anyway, what you can do then, I don't know whether it will show up. Yes. Okay, we can certainly start tidying this up a little bit and say, well, we'll remove the odd tracks because we know it's meant to be that. And you can see where these other sort of flaky bits are. And we could actually say, if I want to have a look at one of these tracks which has an error in, there we go. There, you can start saying, well, what's gone wrong here and why is it an error and what's the error? For this one, the CRC is bad. It could be that one of the bits is a bit flaky inside it. I don't know, you'd have to look at it in more detail. Anyway, that's the basic principle with this. Once you've got that, though, and assuming it looks okay, it's simply a question of just exporting it to an IMG file if it's just simply data that you're interested in preserving or accessing in an emulator, or if you want to use it with one of the floppy emulators, you could save it as an HFE file, and those will work natively with that floppy emulator, and they will work with it. If there's disk protection on there, they'll keep that intact, because essentially all it is a compressed, if you like, version of the flux timings that you've got. So any protection remains intact. For really, really preserving it, though, maintaining those SCP files, that's, if you like, your primary source of the data. If you've got that, you can always create any of the other formats that you'd want to create. So having that SCP, I know it seems big, 30 or 40 meg, but in the great scheme of things in the modern day and age, that's not very big, actually. You could store a huge number of them on a memory stick. So, you know, I think we sit in the past when we think anything bigger than a megabyte is large. Anyway, so yeah, you can export it from there, and away you go. If you find yourself in a situation where some of the tracks haven't decoded properly, or you've got sectors which are bad, the thing that I would probably do at that point is look at, let's see if I can get into this. Okay, what I would probably do at that point is use some different software to have another go at decoding the disk image. So Razor, again, you probably find it on his GitHub, has produced a set of utilities called disk utilities. They run in Linux. They will run in the Windows Linux subsystem. But what you can basically do is run that SCP file through his disk utilities or disk analyze. I paste. There we go. And that will give you another run at it, and it will attempt to decode it. And hopefully, between using the two different bits of software, you'll end up with enough good tracks be able to get the data off the thing. So that and a hex editor together, piecing the pieces together, you should be able to recover a lot more than you would with just one of the bits of software on its own. So there we go. Let's go back to this. So that was an ill-fated live demo, which hopefully was enough to at least show you roughly how it works. There are a few little gotchas with all of this. PC high density drives rotate at 360 RPM, and sometimes it's fine and the software compensates for it. Sometimes it's not clear what's going on, but it's a different data rate than the data rate you'd be expecting with an 80-track double density disk. So be aware of that. That's high density 5¼ inch drive. PC drives are set to drive 1 by default. There are a number of people I've seen go, my disk is not working with my Greaseweazel, and it's because you're asking it to look at the wrong drive. Always check your disks for damage or mold first before you run them through a drive, or you end up with dirty drive heads that you have to clean. Keep the lids off your drive and not clean them with Q-tips. I have personally managed to bend the springs on heads with a Q-tip before, and other people have definitely done it. And although you may be fine, you probably, well, you run the risk of not being fine and knackering a drive. I would generally advise using folded up lens tissue or something like that, or even a chamois tip dipped in isopropanol, and you can slide that between the heads, close the drive door, and just gently move it around, and you won't put any undue pressure on the head. No, Bill, I do not have any 5¼ inch cleaning discs. I do 3½ inch, but 5¼ inch, you'll end up having to pay upwards of 20 quid now, if not more. I think CJE will hire you one for a week for a fair amount of money. So no, I don't have any 5¼ inch cleaning discs. Do not. So actually, Greaseweazel will let you write an SCP file back to a new disk. Don't write 40-track disks and 80-track drives without degaussing the disk first, because you'll end up with artifacts left. The heads are different widths, basically. And it's fine if you read it in another 80-track drive, but if you ever take that and pop it in a 40-track drive, you'll get crosstalk between the tracks that were written on an 8 with the different width heads. And also be prepared to mix and match. So get the sector editor out, work out where things have gone wrong, and see if you can pull in data from other bits. So I think, am I right in thinking that Paul Hiscock spoke to everyone in a previous one of these? Now, I got asked by Dave, this is how all of these things start usually. It's like Dave will say, Daniel, can you have a look at something for me? And I said yes, and that's sort of how I ended up doing this. So basically, as I understood it, Dave had been talking to Paul who previously worked at Computer Concepts and had a game that he'd written called Android Attack, and there were a load of disks, and he tried to recover this off one of the disks, and it hadn't worked. And would I mind taking a look? And I said yes. So what I got was an awful lot of disks, and a lot of them were mouldy, quite mouldy. And mould and disk drives do not get on with each other. So when you encounter this, you've got a couple of options. You can either try and whisk it off with isopropanol, but isopropanol can be a bit aggressive, and I have seen it take the surface off disks before. So, you know, you might want to do that, you might not. What I ended up doing with this disk was cutting open the sleeve and sliding it out completely, the middle bit, and giving it a bath with some fairy liquid, and then letting it dry, and then slipping it into a new clean sleeve, which was from a disc that I didn't care about. Now, I don't know whether you can see this. The disc itself was fairly damaged on. You probably can't. Yeah, actually, I can't really shine a light through it very easily. But basically, because the mould was on the disc, oh, you can possibly see. I don't know whether you can see that the light comes through that there, but there's definitely a big old hole in it where the surface got torn off. But that will be the mould getting stuck on the heads and just general grot and grime on the disc. And if you run it through without cleaning it, you end up with that. So I had a damaged disc, but in a new sleeve, and ran it through the process which I've just described. And this is what sort of dropped out of it. And it wasn't as bad as it could have been, but it wasn't brilliant. So here, that is sector 2. I don't know whether you can see that orange one there. That's sector 2 on track 0, which is part of the directory. There was something wrong there. There was something wrong over here. Something wrong there. These little red bits aren't too much to worry about, but there was also something wrong down here. Now this one isn't a problem, because if you can see, it's a different shade of green. These are empty tracks over here. There's all empty sectors. There's nothing in there, so I wasn't too worried about this. The problems were at the top. And then on side 2 or side 1, sorry, everything was okay apart from this little bit down here again, which was blank anyway, so not anything particularly to worry about. Anyway, I had a go with this. It didn't come out of the HFE software very well. I sent it a copy of the file to Keir Fraser, who ran it through Disk Analyze, which is what I just showed you, which came out with a much better copy of it, but it still wasn't perfect. And then I had some other things to do, but I sent it to Dave just to have a play with, and he sent it to Keith. Now, this is one of the tracks where it was wrong. Just looking at the track view, so you can get at the data and you can see what's there, but the question is what should be there. Anyway, this led to a bit of a discussion between Keith and myself on Facebook one evening, as we sat there with the directory, looking at it in DFS Explorer and a hex editor, and attempting to work out what we thought should be where the files were, whether there was any difference between the files. And between the two of us, and mostly Keith, to be honest, we got the whole disk and all of the files put back together, just with a bit of detective work there. And ultimately now I think we've got working copies of both of the Android disks that Paul gave for us to image. So it was doable, but it you had to get your hands a bit dirty. Anyway, that's basically that. I'm sorry that doesn't seem very organized, this whole thing, but I'm really, really, really happy to take any questions. Okay. So what's the best thing? If I look at the chat, is that the best way of doing this? I think. Wow. Okay. Right. So are all drives and heads made equal? Is there any better success? I've got a TIAC drive is my high density 5 1/4 inch. It's the TIAC 55F or something like that. So it works fine. I've not had any problems with it. And then the 40 track one I've got, I can't remember. I got that new old stock off eBay for 20 quid, because it looked like something worth having. And I'll have to take the lid off it and tell you what it is. I think I can't remember which model it. Can't remember which model it is. I've had no trouble. 3.5-inch. I use a Sony 920, and that's been reliable as anything. So, do I read the disc once using the Greaseweazel? Yes, initially. I would. I tend to assume that you've got one hit on these things initially, so I would try and make sure that the disc is in the best possible condition I can before I attempt to read it. Then read it, and if it doesn't work, I'll give it another go. Or if it's a particular track, I might go straight to that track. So you can use the Greaseweazel software just to sample a range of tracks or a single track. So are the flux captures completely successful? Well, the flux captures are completely successful. They'll capture everything on the disk. The only bits where you sometimes get these sort of weak pulses which read differently, which you can do with, professional mastering equipment. But yeah, you'll possibly get slightly different reads every time you do it. There's flaky bits or fuzzy bits. I don't know. People call them different things, and I'm sure there's big arguments about what they should be called. So, it will give you enough information that you can reconstruct the disk. It pretty much gets pretty much everything. If you really, really, really wanted to do it properly, you'd take a reading off one of the test points before it goes through the amplifiers in the floppy drive, and that would be, the lowest sort of possible thing you could do. So weak, I think. Well, weak is just that. It's a bit that sometimes reads and sometimes doesn't. Where else are we? Any attempt to fix dodgy pulses? No one's written it, but there's absolutely no reason why we can't, because all of the tool chain that I'm using is completely open source. So you could brute force it if you had a rough idea where you thought your dodgy bits were. Yeah, I mean, it just go for it. It's kind of, so what that HFE software does, those red marks where it thinks there are splices, and it very often, if there's damage to the disk surface, it looks like a splice. It looks like that track wasn't written in a continuous sort of stream of data. So you can sort of, you should be able to identify iffy areas and then attempt to fiddle with the bits until the CRC's worked. Sometimes, though, it's the CRC is just registered as 0, which doesn't really give you any indication as to whether you've got the right thing. So if the CRC itself is not right, then, yes, I think the other thing would be to repeatedly sample an area and probably use some sort of heuristic algorithm to try and work out what you think the most likely bit for anything is. Any more?
No questions from me. I was just going to say thanks, Daniel. That was great. I really enjoyed that.
Oh, you're welcome. If anyone thinks of anything, just ask on the forum, or you can nobble me on Facebook. I should say that the Greaseweazel things themselves are really, really, really well supported by Keir Fraser. Even though that entire thing's open, he spends an awful lot of time on it and is very sort of attentive, answering questions and fixing bugs as well, because there obviously are bugs still in the software. So that people encounter from time to time. But these days, I honestly, I don't think I could recommend going another route with it. I don't think that you gain anything from going with a cryoflux or anything like that. In fact, I think it's a bit of a retrograde step these days. So I'd be worried that you'd be reading with errors and only discovering them later when looking at the PC. So I think the thing is, you don't, well, assuming that you've got a clean drive heads and a clean disk, you're basically saying that a disk is, I guess the question is the error something that you can read through, or is the error something which is actually, you've just lost that data from the surface of the disk? Realistically, you're working on a PC which is next to the drive that you've read from. So you're going to see that error as soon as you load that file. So there's nothing to stop you going back and rereading that track again if it appears to be, there appears to be an error on it. If you allow the thing just to hammer away at the disk, you may well just be destroying more of the data or clogging up your heads for later down. At least you get a chance to breathe, think about what you're going to do next, and then do it. I think we always, you know, I once set my cryoflux up to read attempt 50 rereads if it couldn't read a track, and it did basically grind its way through a disk surface, which was not particularly useful because I left it on its own doing it, and it then ripped up further tracks down the disk as it managed to get something that seemed to make sense to it, and then continued to burrow a groove across the disk surface. So I'd prefer to only let it. Can you see lots of disks in one go? Sorry, if anyone can see the text, that's what I'm replying to at the moment. Not conducive of reading lots of disks in one go if there's an element of doctoring the result. I would argue that you should. I mean, to be honest, actually, one thing I would say is that you can just plug in some level of decoding, and I think Keir is in the process of plugging in some level of decoding in the Cryoflux in the Greaseweazel software. So at the moment you can read directly to HFE, and I think you should be able to read directly to sector image as well. But you're not doctoring the images, you're looking at them and checking them. And I'd argue if what you're trying to do is preserve things, you shouldn't be sort of running through headlong in a sort of conveyor belt fashion. You should probably be taking your time with each image. I know that that's probably irritating, but you know, I think that Android attack one is a case in point that needed time to look at and consider and work out what best to do with it. You know, if you want to get through an awful lot of disks awfully quickly, then yeah, by all means. Are there any plans to host an SCP archive? I think there should be. I think that would be the ideal thing to preserve. I don't know where we'd do it and how we'd do it, but I genuinely think that's what we should be keeping. I think if you talk to Keir Fraser, he'll say that there are a couple of things that SCP as a format can't quite capture, but with a couple of extensions it could. And I think that's probably a broader discussion that needs to be had. So if anyone has any ideas about that.
Daniel, I have a question.
Sure.
Some of the 5 1/4 80 track drives have extra tracks on them.
Yeah.
Is this the case with 3.5 inch?
Yeah, 3.5 go up to 84 very often.
Oh, that's good, because I've got a piece of software, a bit of DOS software on 5 1/4 that actually stores how many installations you have on the past the 80 track. So I want to convert that down into 3.5 so I can actually use it.
Yeah, no, it will. there at least, I've not seen a 5 1/4 that's gone past 82 tracks, but I've seen 3 1/2 go 82 or 84.
That's lovely, thanks.
That's an Electron Exile, I think. Yeah, I mean, I think HFE is a really, really good sort of compromise between file size and sort of serving the original what was on the disk. Simply because you can run these things unmodified and unhacked from HFE files, but obviously it does lose some of the stuff, and ideally I think we'd look to try and preserve everything as SCP files. At least then you can always go back to the source and do something else with it if we decide that if someone decides that something else is better at a later date. But the more data we can store, the better, I would always say.